All right. Thank you so much for joining everyone today. We appreciate your attendance. Today, we are going to be talking about why class setting matters, making sense of the least restrictive environment. I know whenever I first heard about LRE for my own child, I had no idea what LRE was. I didn't know what the acronym was. I didn't know how it was determined, anything like that. And so it was quite an education, and I could have really benefited from having a Susan Thomas in my life at that time. So fortunately for us, we have her with us now. And so, Susan, if you will, in just a second, share with us some information about least restrictive environment. I will go ahead and say that if you have any questions or if you need more specific information, please feel free to reach out to Family Connection directly. I've put in the chat a link that you can submit a referral, or you can call us on our 1-800 number. So feel free to do that. I have also included some information or a link about other upcoming trainings that we're going to have. And so I encourage you to take a look at that as well. But Susan, I'm going to hand it over to you so that you can help us understand all the considerations and all the things that we need to think about whenever we're talking about least restrictive environment.
Well, perfect. Thanks so much, Melissa. I don't know that least restrictive environment is the most exciting thing that we could be talking about, but it is an important one because it is part of our IEP process, and it's one that we want to make sure that we are following the law and understanding, interpreting the law. And the one thing that, and I'm just going to go through some things that the law says and also some guidance that we have. So I'm so glad to be a part of consulting with Family Connections. It's one of the most fun things I do. I am a retired special education director and now do consulting. And so LRE is something certainly that I've had many discussions about. First of all, I just want you to know that I'm using resources from a couple of places, and we have this information we're going to share with you. We've downloaded it, but it's on the Iris Center. There is an information brief on least restrictive environment, and I think it's very well done, does a great job of explaining what it is. And so I've used that as one of my resources. And then the Pacer Center has a 2-page document on least restrictive environment that has a little bit more about the law and what the law says about it. So those are my 2 references for today, and I want to acknowledge the work of both of those centers and how much they help us with understanding special education. Well, I always like to start with the law, because when we start with the law, we can be sure we can kind of know where to go, and of course then we have to think about how people interpret the law. But really and truly, everything about least restrictive environment starts with that word FAPE, which is a free, appropriate public education. And what the law says, and we all, if you've been in special ed, you know this, but we have to make available to all children in our state between the ages of 3 and 21 a FAPE. We have to provide them with that free and appropriate public education. And that includes even students who have been suspended or expelled from school. And so in doing that, part of FAPE is really kind of talks about the least restrictive environment. And that is how we serve children and where we serve them. And so this is from the law. What the law says about LRE requirements. I like to just go straight to it. And it says to the maximum extent appropriate. And appropriate is the big word there. Who determines appropriate? How do we know what's appropriate? But that's the catcher there. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. So one of the first things we have to do is we have to determine, what appropriate is. And we're going to talk about some considerations for that. The other part of this LRE requirements, special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children from disabilities from the regular educational environment only occurs if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved. So we remove students when we cannot get the services that are appropriate. That's when we remove students from general education. And so we want to make sure that we kind of have a thought process to go through that. So who and how do we make those decisions? Well, the IEP team makes that decision. And remember, the IEP team includes the parent. And I like this part of the law from it's section 300, 327 that really talks about placement. And it says that we have to ensure that the parents of each child with a disability are members of any group that makes decisions on educational placements of their child. So it's very important for parents to be a part of this process and for parents to understand this process. And that IEP process, LRE, should be discussed annually or more often if needed. And so there are times when students are not progressing that we have to meet during the year and decide to put more intensive services, or maybe a child is really is able to handle time in that general education classroom. So data helps us to make those decisions, but we should always talk about LRE. It should not just be assumed. And that's pretty much the last thing we decide once we've developed the IEP. We've got all those pieces in place, and then we talk about LRE. Remember that special education services and supports, this is from the law. These are the three biggies. They ensure that each student is making progress toward their annual and academic functional goals. They have to be progressing on their goals. They're involved and making progress in the general curricula. Doesn't say in the general classroom, it says in the general curricula. And so we're working towards getting students, sometimes they might be working below the standards levels, but they're progressing in that general curricula. And then that they're participating with students with and without disabilities in academic and non-academic areas. And so those are the things that special ed does. And so let's kind of talk about the continuum of placements in IDEA, because this is where we get least restrictive environment from. So least restrictive, and you can see that I've got down there, would be in general education with getting supplementary services, aids and services. Then we have special education classrooms that starts going up the ladder of more restrictive placements. And then we have a special school that would be something like the School for the Deaf and Blind, or if you live in the Spartanburg area, McCarthy Tesla is a specialized school for students with disabilities, home, and then hospital or residential setting. And so would be the most restrictive. And that's the way we think about the continuum of placements. And so all of these are options when we are considering what a student needs. Nothing's off the table. We don't make placement decisions by disability category. That's nowhere in the law. In fact, we're not supposed to. And so we are always thinking about where is the most appropriate place for this student. And then we have to ensure LRE in non-academic settings as well, lunch and recess and sports, clubs, after school care. You know, one of the things that I think is so important for students is that they are having time for social activities with non-academic, and this is where you do include those students. They might need to be in a special education classroom with specially designed instruction for reading, but they don't need that at lunchtime. And so we want to make sure that we have ways to have students included in things. And so those are kind of the two big things we talk about when we're developing the IEP. So how does this work? Well, I like to think about it like when I go to the doctor. So I go to the doctor and this happened to me, by the way, not the whole story, but part of it. And I find out that I have a blood pressure problem. So think about that. We have kids that have needs, okay? And so my doctor looks at all my medical records, checks everything out, checks my blood work out. They get more data to make decisions. They're looking at lots of different pieces of data, including what I'm telling the doctor. Might be telling him about my diet and exercise program. And so several things might happen at that point. One thing the doctor could say, look, go home. You need to make sure you're exercising and eating right. Have at it. And that might be good and that might work. And that would not be restrictive. And I'm doing it and I know it's working because my blood pressure is down. The data supports it. And then, but maybe it wasn't working and I'm not doing well with the exercise. So I need some additional support. So I get a personal trainer to help me with the exercise. And I'm looking at my data to see how I'm doing. Is it working? Oh, still not working well. So we've got to add some additional services like medication to help get my blood pressure down. So I'm doing more and more restrictive things that take more. And then they might say, you know what, you really need to see a specialist. My primary doctor says, we need somebody who can give you this specially designed care. And so I will get that, go see the cardiologist. And if I was really, really in bad shape, they may decide that I need to be in a cardiac rehab program. And that would be extremely restrictive. But every time we add or make decisions, we're going to make sure we have data to make those decisions. We're going to see how it's working. And so really LRE is kind of the same way. So we're going to start with good data. So we want to make sure we have good present levels of performance that determine the needs. And that's the strongest, I always say, if you're going to have, if you don't have good present levels of performance, the chances are you're not going to have a very, very well written IEP. And that includes that we have data that is, and we'll talk about this in the IEP training. We have data that tells us how our student is doing compared to others, but that we also have diagnostic data to show those specific needs and also specific strengths. And from those present levels, we're going to identify the goals that we want to set for the child. And what are those high priority goals? Can't do everything. What are we really focusing on? And then we're going to determine the services and supports that are needed. And then we make decisions based on each goal. And I like to give the example of if and I hope I don't have this in a future slide, sometimes get ahead of myself. But if I have a student who's in the 8th grade and they can't read, there is nothing in the 8th grade standards that teaches kindergarten and 1st grade level reading in a general education classroom. So that might be a time when I say this child's going to have reading instruction in a special education placement. And that would be appropriate because that child is getting what they need. And appropriate is the key word. So here's the perfect equation for finding the place. We've got special education and related services that need to be provided. And then we've got the accommodations and modifications that students need to be successful. And then we have a successful student. And so when we're using data and we've got those goals and we've got services that are designed to meet the goals and we're measuring progress, we should have a successful student. And so schools have to decide all kinds of ways that they're going to provide these services. Here's some things, I always like guiding questions and things to consider when teams are talking. And so here's some ideas of some things you should be thinking about. So when we're looking at talking about where can we best serve the student, what will be the LRE for these goals that we're talking about? We want to look at strengths when we start thinking about it, because one of the things we want children to do is to be successful. And so strengths is, I always say, where we start with placing children in the general education curriculum. And so, and then thinking about how can we support them there with accommodations and modifications. And so that's a great place to start, is to look at all the strengths and make those decisions based on that. Because, and I'll just give you an example, child has, maybe has a reading deficit, but you know what? They can participate in social studies and science. They love those things. Well, we can put accommodations and modifications in place for them to be part of the general education classroom and get that content and be a part of being educated with their non-disabled peers. Then we have to think about those needs, and that's those areas where we know students need specially designed instruction, and how much are they going to need. We've got to think about the goal of the student. And I gave you an example just a minute ago about a student that really needs intensive reading instruction. We don't want them sitting in a general education classroom where they're not learning because they can't access. So we've got to have benefit. And then also we like to look at student preferences. Students sometimes want smaller group instruction. They do better with that. I mean, there's all kinds of considerations when we're making those decisions. And then a lot of people don't want to talk about this, but we do need to consider the benefits versus the harm. And I always say, let's make a list. Think about the pros and cons. I've had families who really wanted their child in a general education classroom. In fact, sometimes they've asked, can we put them in there with a teaching assistant with them? Well, that teaching assistant is not teaching them. They're helping them to get through the day. We have to look at what the child's learning. So yes, they're in a general ed classroom, but if they're not learning, then that would be a con. And so we want to make those lists and think about it, because remember, we're looking at progress on their goals and learning, true learning. And then there is a part that we're asked to consider about the effect. What effect does the student have on others? So we know that if behavior is impeding the learning of others, that might be a time when we need to restrict the environment because it's an unfavorable, until we can get that student with a good behavior plan and work on that and get them ready to transition back in. There's not a perfect answer to this, but you do want to think about this. And how does the child think about this? What are they saying to you as a parent about their classroom placement? We want kids to feel successful at school. And if they're going to school every day and they don't feel successful, that's not good. And it's also not helping in their classroom, fitting in their classroom a lot of times. And then this is the big one. Will this result in positive outcomes for the student? I hear a lot of times, well, we do, we have inclusion. We use inclusion classes, but we have to think about it's not inclusion, it is progress. The law talks about progress towards the goal, attaining the goal, and being involved in the general curricula. And so that's what we have to remember. And then we have to identify the identification of skills that inclusionary practices will support. And so we want to make sure we're thinking about what skills will this child need to have those positive outcomes. And sometimes those things need to be taught in a smaller setting, with specially designed instruction, and that is special education. We want to make sure that the accommodations, modifications, supplementary aids, and that should say, are they doable and efficient in the setting? Sometimes if that child needs so much that it doesn't look, it's almost too much to do, we may need to think about a different way. Or is this a time where we want to remove this child for some specialized instruction? Remember, key word here is still progress. Is the student making progress? So here's my favorite. How do we know it's working? We know it's working if we're progress monitoring. And progress monitoring should be occurring even if a child spends most of their day in the general education classroom. They should be regularly, frequently progress monitored on their goals. And if they are not making satisfactory progress, the team has to talk. Grades are not progress monitoring. A child can have good grades and still not be gaining the skills. So one of the things, a lot of times we have programs where the special ed teacher is helping the child to finish general education classroom assignments, but they are not teaching them the skills that they need, the metacognitive skills and strategies that they need to be successful themselves. They're actually enabling the child to finish an assignment. And so that's why we don't use that. That's why we have to have a separate measure to make those decisions by, and we're required to report progress anyway. And remember, teams should meet if the child's not making adequate progress. And I always say ambitious progress, because we want them to be learning as much as they can. And so based on that child's unique needs. So here's a few warning things that I just want to talk about. And Melissa, I don't know if you've ever heard any of these, but these are problems when we hear we are a full inclusion school.
Oh, yes. I was going to say that's one of those where it can sound great, but then you've also got to think, wait, ding, ding, ding.
That is actually against the law to do things like that, because we don't make decisions that way. It's an individual decision. I have that note at the bottom. This is our schedule. Your child will be in support for 30 minutes. If they need more, then we have to figure out. And that is hard. Scheduling's hard. I'm just going to be honest with you. That's one of the hardest things schools have to deal with, is how do we schedule all this time? If your child is in a self-contained program, they can never earn a diploma. It all depends. But when I hear that, I will just say there are some students, and remember, every child's an individual, but we have some students who have really severe behavioral and emotional needs. That is their disability, and being in large classes is not a good thing. And so they may be a student who needs to be in a smaller setting. And thank goodness we have so many virtual options now, because it's made life so much easier for us to get those students through with their diploma, because academically might not be their area of need. Their area of need is to have that environmental support. That is their disability, and their area of need looks different. And so we got to be careful about that. And also, there's plenty of time to be making those decisions. I heard recently that an elementary school had told a parent the child could not be moved because then they'd never earn a diploma. Ooh, that's not good. And also things like we have to try general education to see if they can make it first. Because remember, the team looks at the data and then they decide what the child needs and where that can be given. And so it's not a wake to fail model. We're going to try them in a little bit of general ed. Well, we should already know that general ed wasn't working if they're a child with a disability. That's how they got to special ed. Now, I don't want you to even think that I am against inclusion or, kids co-teaching, those kinds of things. Did them as a teacher, but we have to make the decisions based on the child. And it is very hard for schools, particularly right now with our teacher shortage, to get all this done. And so we have to be thoughtful, and we have to work with our schools to do that, to help them think about how that can be done. My big push right now is, we've got to improve our literacy scores of students with disabilities in our state. And so some of those children need really specially designed instruction to do that. And so we cannot continue to leave them sitting in a general education classroom year after year getting a little bit of special ed, because what our data shows is our self-contained numbers go up as kids get older and we go to more restrictive environments. And I would say that if we'd rethink this and say, hey, when a child's behind in reading, we might want to restrict their environment, get them reading, and then go to a lesser restrictive environment because they have that number one skill that we know students need. So if you hear some of these things, that's a warning sign, because LRE is an individual decision. And the law is clear about that. Um, Sometimes I get questions about, placements for schools. Like a lot of times schools have a specialized classroom in another building. That is okay for schools, for districts to do. That's not a part, that's not that you're not getting LRE. We want districts have to use their resources to get those programs in place. LRE really does have to do with the placement and the kind of classroom. And so, there's a lot of questions that come up about this. And I think teams just having those good conversations about how are we going to best get the appropriate services so that the child can advance towards attaining those goals and be involved in the general curricula. So, Melissa, questions?
Yes, ma'am. We do have actually it's more of a comment. Hold on one second. Let me pull that up. Whenever you had commented on students being behind in reading, and that is a big concern right now. One person had commented that gen ed students are behind in reading too, that this is not something that is unfortunately unique to um, students that are in special education.
And so a lot of times, and I agree, and you don't want to get me off on this because we'll still be here at 7 o'clock tonight because literacy, I'm pretty passionate about it. But, we found that when I was teaching eons ago, because I'm an old woman, we actually did some co-teaching and used the instructional strategies that I know as a special educator. And I pushed into the classrooms, and I was actually the lead on providing instruction to students. And so that works out great, because guess what? Wins. And of course, I had good progress monitoring data that my students were making their growth, but also guess what? Their non-disabled peers were as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are creative things that we can do, and we did something different than what the rest of our school was doing.
Mm-hmm.
We really tailored this at each grade level to meet the needs of students, and our principal was an amazing principal that allowed us to do that, and it was we had great results.
Wonderful. Yes. Let's see. We've got somebody had commented, that the IEP is a fluid document, so it can be changed anytime. It's not set in stone. Now, I'm not sure if this is a question or just a comment, but someone had said if they go in self-contained, they can be in gen ed at the same time and still on track for diploma. Okay, I think that's more of a statement.
Yeah.
So,
And absolutely, it just depends. We can be as the one thing about our law, there's some things we have to do, but as far as the way we serve students, that team makes those decisions, and we can be creative in the way we do it.
yes, yeah. Someone else had asked, and I'm not knowledgeable in this area. It says, when is the new reading program coming out? Is the state looking at a new
So we
reading
are getting
program?
new English language arts standards, and they're supposed to be, in fact, I'm going in 2 weeks um, for them to kind of they're going to show them, I think, to a group of educators. I mean, they're done. I think they're ready, and they are more aligned with our science of reading. And so I know they're going to be going in. You have a transition time because of the assessment. So and I'm not sure what that schedule is. I haven't looked at that, but I do know the new standards are ready.
Okay, wonderful.
And then school districts do have an option. There have been some reading programs that for elementary that have are on the state, well, they were on the State Department website, but there are 5 evidence-based programs that follow the science of reading that some districts have picked up on.
Okay, wonderful. So now, whenever you say that some districts have picked up on, and I know this is not LRE, this is where you're right. We can run down the reading rainbow quite easily. But whenever you said some districts have picked up on, is it an optional um, thing for folks to opt in? It's not. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. So it is, and this goes along earlier with one of the questions. It says, can the student be in a self-contained class for core subjects and then go to gen ed for social studies and science and be on track for diploma?
Depends on their age and what's going on in the special ed classroom. They would have to still, so like if they were in high school and they would have to be getting the same level of instruction. And so a lot of times a child could be in a classroom if they can do it and maybe have a virtual instruction. Sometimes there's some programs that do that
Mhm.
by a certified teacher. The biggest problem is when we get into high school and earning units. And
Right. Earning
so,
those Carnegie units.
it depends on how you set it up. I know, we use some virtual for a couple of students that were able to gain that.
Mhm. Well, and I know, and I'm going to go back because they put a clarifying thing in there. But I wanted to also mention, I know that we have at least one school up here in Greenville County where there is a self-contained class for students that have like emotional disability, behavioral, but where they are on diploma track. It is I can do the work, but I need these extra behavioral supports that I can't necessarily. It's too intensive to have in the gen ed class, and so where that is something that I know Greenville County has tried. Now, she had mentioned that her child is at the elementary level. So, Susan, could you speak to the if a student is in self-contained?
So,
Hmm.
yeah, I see what she's saying. It de it depends on the instruction that is going on. So I think what you have to think about sometimes is students are actually better off with their special ed teacher to narrow the focus of what they're learning. So in a general education classroom, um, you know, there's a lot. They're more than the standards, they're covering the standards, but they're covering them at a rapid pace. And so kids aren't getting mastery of those essential skill standards. That's what I call them. They're the bang for the buck that have leverage and endurance
Mm-hmm.
to go on to the next year.
Right.
And so in schools that are looking at that, it would all depend. And so there's a multiple ways to do things to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, I had some students that I was their reading teacher, teaching them how to read. And then because we were able to schedule where they did some other things where we could put accommodations in, like learning about character settings, plot, those
Mm-hmm.
literary elements. They did those in the general classroom. But I was narrowing their focus and giving them more opportunities to practice. The bottom line is if they're not learning in their general classroom, why are we leaving them there?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so that's the key is
Mm-hmm.
are they learning at an appropriate rate and able to meet their goals? And so and I was somebody she asked, was that resource? And yes, I did resource or supplemental supports. And so, but I taught some kids, I was their primary teacher, and most of our teachers are also certified. Like I am a certified elementary teacher as well as special ed. In
So
fact,
you
I was a gen ed teacher first.
right. So you could have where your student is primarily a gen ed student, but they do go to the resource room for that very specialized instruction
Right. But
and
it
skills and strategies that hopefully they could carry over in the.
right. But it should never be that they're going there to finish assignments
Mhm.
for the general ed classroom. It should always be about teaching them the skills they need to mastery.
Right.
And
Right.
so, and because that's how we measure progress. So,
Mhm. Right. I had mentioned to Susan earlier, whenever she and I were talking about LRE, and, I had said it would be like if I was sitting in a physics class, it, I could be physically located in that room and hearing the same lessons that other people are hearing, but because my brain doesn't work like that, because that kind of thing is really, really challenging for me, I don't know that I would necessarily make progress. So it doesn't do me any good to be sitting in the physics room whenever I could actually make progress over in biology or earth science or something like that. It all depends on the individual and what they can.
absolutely. And I can't say that enough. And I appreciate the comment about Andrew F. I hear,
Mhm.
because, that is one case where the child was not making progress and the parents pulled him out and put him in a specialized private school for students with disabilities where he did make progress.
Mhm.
And so, making sure we're teaching those skills that students need, teaching the social skills, teaching the, those what I call them adaptive skills, executive
Mhm.
functioning, all of those things that
Mhm.
are part of functional performance. We have to be able to teach those as well. And
Right.
so that's important.
Right.
So
Someone had asked, did the school pay for the private school?
after the Supreme Court case, the district had to pay over $1.3 million.
Right. But it was a long road to get to that.
It was a long
Yeah,
road to
it
get
was
to
a
that.
long
But
road to get.
the parents did remove him and put him in a very, what we would call a very restrictive setting.
Hmm. Right.
A
But
private,
it's what he needed to make progress.
correct.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's why we have to, those are individual decisions. And, my question is, could they have done things that would have been better that they never got to that point?
Right.
And
Yeah.
remember, he had 2 years
Early
with
on.
no progress on goals.
Hmm.
We don't
Right.
wait even a year. If
Mm.
the child's not progressing, the team needs to meet.
Right. And I think that is where, we go back to, and this is something that we talk about at Family Connection all the time, which is, we go back to asking those questions and saying, we as parents, we don't have to have all the answers, but we do need to ask the questions. We do need to say, hey, I noticed that, we've got the exact same goals that we've had for 2 years, and he's still at the same reading level. Can we talk about what we can do different, um, so that we can start seeing some progress? And,
Absolutely.
it may be, do we need more time? Do we need a different way of doing it? And again, as mom, I don't have all the answers, but you better believe I got a bunch of questions. And so it's important for us to ask those questions to help the team. And it's not questioning like I am challenging you. It is questioning in a, let's make sure we're really thinking through all of this and considering all of our options, you know?
Just like if I have a checkup next week at the doctor. If my blood pressure is not good,
Mhm.
then there's going to be something else to happen, right? that 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 doctor's going to say, probably need to watch what you're eating, Susan. The diet thing isn't going so well right now.
And then you'll say, I don't know what you're talking about.
Hmm.
Move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And
Um,
somebody asked about present levels. This is my rule. Okay. This is just, the Susan Thomas rule is I'm going to update present levels anytime I open up an IEP,
yeah,
because we're making, if we're meeting because we think there needs to be changes, we always want to make it on the most current data. And
right.
so, I keep my data, and it's no problem for me to plop that right in. And sometimes you
Mhm.
don't have to change everything because maybe they hadn't taken MAP,
Mhm.
again. So, but you do, like your formative curriculum based measurement, we want to see the most recent, and not only where they are, but we want to look at how they're progressing. So,
Mhm.
particularly in academics. And we probably need to, that's probably another training session, Melissa, to
It
talk about using
probably,
curriculum based measurement.
yes, yeah. Well, and it is called present levels. It's not called fairly recent levels. I mean, it's
Right.
we are
I,
we are right now.
absolutely. And we've got a question about parent input.
Yeah,
Absolutely, parent input. And, um, I was doing IP training not too long ago, and I said, if I've had parents that are maybe they're having their child tutored. I want to know that. I want to know what the
right.
tutor's working on. I've
Hmm.
also had parents who will tell me, look, when we get home from school, we start at, 4 o'clock and we're doing homework until 9 o'clock and everybody in the house is crying by the end of the night. Okay, that's not normal. And we
Hmm.
and and that input, we need to know that. And we always want to be asking for input. Absolutely. And it's not at the meeting. I like to gather that before the meeting.
Right, right. All right. So Hannah had asked, how can a parent bring data to an IEP meeting when they think that the child is not making progress? What would be data? What would be something that you would bring up to the team?
Well, I think sometimes I think number one, we have to agree about how we're going to monitor progress at the
Hmm.
IEP meeting time. Okay. And so I would have to say that's the tool to measure progress. And there are all and one of the reasons I believe that for reading and math, we should be using curriculum based measurement, which is or those fluency measures, is because that is a well researched and validated way for us to measure growth.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's important. A lot of times on some of the other assessments that we have, it's not sensitive to small increments of growth, so it may be hard to see. And so,
Hmm.
and those tests are one point in time. But I think anytime you have concerns, then you need to ask the questions. I mean, if you have some other data, if your child's being tutored and there's data, share that. That doesn't mean it's not pitting against each other. It's another piece of information.
Right. Hmm.
And so I would have to say you would want to look at that. And so somebody asked about, if you have private speech, OT, and PT, and we have to realize that those private um, service providers sometimes are working on different things because our school people are working, their job is to work on school stuff.
Hmm.
However, I'm always a believer the more data we have, the better, because we do want to compare and see. I mean, if I have a speech therapist that says a child can do something and the school's not seeing it, well, isn't that a great opportunity to figure out why?
Hmm.
you know, and vice versa. If the school sees things that the parent doesn't, context matters, and what happens at home might look different than what happens at school.
Hmm.
And so we, it's all pulling it all together.
Well, and it's helpful to look at it in terms of being able to transfer those skills from one
Right.
place to another.
And
That can be an issue.
absolutely. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that I know schools struggle with is it's the time of our teachers that they have to really invest in, pulling everything together. I mean, it's tough times right now for teachers and pulling all that IP pulling IPs together and teaching and meeting and and so I want us to do a better job on that of giving them time to have to do that.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I thank everybody so much for joining us today. There have been some great comments in the chat, and we appreciate it and appreciate your time that you spent with us today during your lunch hour. So thank you so much for joining us. The slides, the PowerPoint will be sent out in the follow-up email that I send you. There will also be a link to complete a survey. And we really appreciate your feedback on those because those give us information that help us better determine what kinds of trainings we need, what kind of information do parents appreciate and find helpful, and what do they not. And so that way we don't do that. So I appreciate your taking the time to complete that survey for us. The video from this session will be posted to our website in the next couple of weeks. So just take a look for that. If you go to the Family Connection website and look under trainings and virtual trainings, you will be able to find it there. So thank you so much again, Susan, for sharing your experience and wisdom with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Thomas. Bye.
Bye.